At 2144 local time, the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait is performing the specific geographic function it has performed for every civilization that has depended on connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden since approximately the dawn of maritime trade, which is to say it is being narrow, 18 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. On the eastern side, the coast of Djibouti, lights visible at 7 nautical miles. On the western side, the coast of Yemen, no lights visible because the coast of Yemen in 2024 has been without reliable power infrastructure for long enough that its darkness is the darkness of a conflict that began before this watch section came aboard. In the middle, the shipping lanes, busy even at 2144, because the Bab-el-Mandeb does not close for inconvenient hours, and the commercial traffic that has been navigating around or through the Houthi maritime threat for 18 months has developed the specific resilience of an economic necessity that cannot be rerouted without consequences that the global economy has already partially experienced and would prefer not to fully experience. USS Mason, hull number DDG-87, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, is making 14 knots through the center of the strait, southbound. The ship has been here before, not in the abstract institutional sense in which all Arleigh Burke-class destroyers have been in this strait, but in the specific operational sense in which USS Mason has been in this strait during active Houthi maritime operations and has managed the specific category of attention that the Houthi maritime program pays to U.S. Navy warships, transiting this choke point with the practiced efficiency of a ship that has done it before and has strong professional opinions about every aspect of the approach. The watch section at 2144 is alert in the way that USS Mason's watch sections are always alert in the Bab-el-Mandeb, which is to say they are not relaxed at any point in the 18-mile transit and have structured their watch routine accordingly. The tactical picture is complex. The Bab-el-Mandeb always produces a complex tactical picture. Commercial traffic on the shipping lanes, dhows and small fishing craft in the coastal zones, the specific electronic environment of a geographic choke point that multiple military and commercial radar systems cover simultaneously, and the background noise of a conflict that has been active on the western shore for a decade, and that produces, on any given night, the kind of radar and electronic returns that require experienced operators to sort into categories. The watch section has experienced operators. At 2144, one of those operators found something that did not belong to any of the established categories. It was not on the shipping lanes. It was not in the coastal fishing zone. It was in the approximately 2.5 nautical mile gap between the edge of the northbound shipping lane and the 3 nautical mile limit of Yemeni territorial waters, the corridor of international waters through which small, fast, aggressive things have been approaching U.S. Navy ships in this strait for the better part of a year. The contact was at 5 nautical miles. It was making 14 knots. It was not broadcasting an AIS transponder signal. It was a surface return approximately consistent with a 3 to 4 meter object, which is not the return of a large vessel, not the return of a small fishing boat at anchor, and not the return of a wave. The radar operator had been looking at wave returns in the Bab-el-Mandeb since 1900 and knew the difference. He classified the contact as unknown surface, small, non-cooperative, and called it to the tactical action officer. The tactical action officer had the contact on his display 11 seconds after the call. He looked at it for 3 seconds. He reached for his radio. In the specific tactical environment of the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait in late 2024, a 5 nautical mile, 14-knot, non-cooperative surface contact on the port quarter of a U.S. Navy destroyer is not an uncharacterized ambiguity that the watch section approaches with academic curiosity. It is a contact that activates the specific threat profile that the force protection brief for this transit had described in operational detail. And the force protection brief had been written by people who had been tracking the Houthi maritime surface drone program with the attention that a new and developing threat category receives from people whose ships are in the relevant operating area. The contact was consistent with the program's assessed vehicle parameters in speed, size, and approach geometry. It was also, to be precise, consistent with other things: a small power boat, a large piece of debris making way in a current, a sensor anomaly, and the classification threshold for weapons employment in international waters against a contact that is not confirmed as a direct threat is not consistent with. This is the vulnerability that the contact's geometry was making acute at 2144. The Bab-el-Mandeb Strait is 18 miles wide. USS Mason at 14 knots and the contact at 14 knots on an intercept bearing were generating a closure rate of approximately 28 knots combined, because the strait geometry was producing an approach angle that added their speeds rather than subtracting them. At 28 knots closure, from 5 nautical miles, the contact would reach the ship's 1 nautical mile minimum engagement range in approximately 10 minutes. 10 minutes is the classification window. 10 minutes is the difference between a confirmed threat response and an unclassified surface contact report. The tactical action officer began working the problem. The commanding officer was in CIC within 60 seconds of the contact call. The force protection brief's threat characterization was on the primary display alongside the contact track. The commanding officer looked at both. He looked at the strait geometry. He looked at the commercial traffic, a laden container vessel in the southbound lane at 2 nautical miles, a tanker in the northbound lane at 3, both of which were navigation constraints that limited the maneuvering room available on either side of the shipping corridor. He looked at the contact. He looked at the classification clock. Classification status. Unknown surface, sir. Consistent with threat profile, not confirmed. Non-cooperative. Bearing 175, range 4.8 nautical miles. Closing at approximately 28 knots. Electro-optical. The electro-optical system, the ship's long-range camera suite on the mast, infrared capable, stabilized, slewed to the contact bearing at 2145 and 12 seconds. The range was 4.8 nautical miles. The infrared image at this range of a 3 to 4 meters surface object at night in light chop is not cinematic. It is a thermal signature, a heat differential between the contact and the surrounding water that tells the operators that something warm is moving. The propulsion signature was visible. A thermal plume consistent with an internal combustion or electric motor at sustained output. Aft of the contact, the wake pattern consistent with a planning hull rather than a displacement hull. At 14 knots, a planning hull means relatively high engine output for the contact's size. The operators noted this. EO contact confirmed. Thermal signature consistent with high output motor drive. Wake pattern consistent with planning hull. A pause. No personnel visible at this range. No personnel visible. This was, in the classification framework, a significant observation. A small boat with a person aboard produces a thermal signature at its occupant position, a hotspot that the infrared system resolves at this range as a blob of elevated temperature at the appropriate height above the hull. The contact had no such hotspot. The thermal picture showed motor output, wake, and hull, but not the occupant signature that small piloted boats produce. This was consistent with an unmanned vehicle. It was also consistent with a piloted boat, whose operator was lying flat to minimize thermal signature, which is a thing that people who understand infrared systems do when they want to minimize infrared detection. The classification framework required more. Distance to enter weapons employment threshold at current closure rate. 7 minutes and 40 seconds, sir. 7 minutes and 40 seconds. The commanding officer looked at the options available in 7 minutes and 40 seconds in a 17-mile wide strait, with commercial traffic to port and starboard, and a non-cooperative contact closing at 28 knots combined. The first option was the Mk-38 25mm chain gun, which was already manned by the gun crew that had been at the weapon since the transit began, because the force protection brief had specified gun crew manned for the Bab-el-Mandeb transit. Range approximately 2 nautical miles effective against a surface contact of this size. The Mk-38 crew had the contact on their own ballistic display. They were ready. The second option was the ship's CIWS, which operated in surface mode and could engage the contact from approximately 2.5 nautical miles. The CIWS was in surface mode, tracking the contact as a cue. The third option was the course change. But the strait's geometry was producing a constraint that the commanding officer was calculating simultaneously. A course change to open the contact bearing required a maneuver to starboard, which put the ship closer to the northbound shipping lane and the northbound tanker at 3 nautical miles. A course change to port put the ship closer to the Yemeni territorial water limit. Neither course change was freely available without creating a secondary navigation problem. And the secondary navigation problem in the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait at 2144 with commercial traffic in both adjacent lanes was the kind of navigation problem that produces consequences regardless of how the primary tactical problem resolves. The commanding officer had a fourth option. It was the one that the force protection brief had specifically noted for this contact type in this geographic environment. He picked up the radio on the International Maritime Distress Frequency, Channel 16, and broadcast. Unknown vessel, bearing 175 from U.S. Navy warship. This is United States Navy warship. Please identify yourself and state your intentions. The broadcast was in English and Arabic. The broadcast was standard maritime hailing protocol. The broadcast was also a data collection event. The contact's response, or lack of response, to a Channel 16 hail was an additional classification input. Unmanned vehicles do not respond to Channel 16 hails because they have no communications equipment tuned to Channel 16 and no operator listening to it in real time. Piloted boats can respond. The presence or absence of a response would not confirm the classification. A piloted boat with hostile intent might deliberately not respond, but the absence of a response was consistent with the unmanned classification and was being logged. No response. The contact's bearing had not changed. Its speed had not changed. Its course had not changed. 6 minutes and 10 seconds. At 2149, the passive acoustic collection suite, the hull-mounted receiver that the ship uses for low-frequency detection, reported an acoustic signature at the contact's bearing that it had not previously reported. The signature was brief, 11 seconds, consistent with an internal combustion engine in a specific RPM range. The acoustic library had an entry for this RPM range from a previous collection event against a contact assessed as a Houthi maritime surface drone. An entry with a quality notation of possible, based on a single prior acquisition of insufficient duration to characterize fully. This contact's 11-second signature, at a range that produced better signal quality than the previous collection, was being compared against the library entry in real time by the acoustic processor. Acoustic contact confirmed. Bearing consistent with visual contact. RPM signature consistent with library entry from previous Houthi maritime drone contact. Confidence? Probable, probable. The tactical action officer updated the contact classification. Probable unmanned surface vehicle, Houthi maritime drone assessed. The commanding officer looked at the classification. He looked at the range, 3.1 nautical miles. He looked at the closure rate. He looked at the CIWS tracking data on the primary display. CIWS weapons free. Mk-38 weapons free at 2 nautical miles. The CIWS in surface mode had been tracking the contact since 2144. At 2.6 nautical miles, the contact entered the CIWS surface mode engagement envelope. The system engaged at 2150 and 31 seconds. The 20-millimeter burst lasted approximately 2 seconds. The same system, the same burst duration, the same engagement geometry as phalanx engagements in every previous encounter with surface contacts. The burst produced the outcome that 20-millimeter fire at 4,500 rounds per minute produces against a 3-meter composite hull at 2.6 nautical miles. The contact ceased to produce a surface radar return at the same position and continued to produce a debris field return for approximately 45 seconds before the debris dispersed below the radar's minimum detectable return. The Mk-38 crew, who had been ready at their weapon for 4 minutes and 47 seconds, did not fire. The CIWS had resolved the engagement before the Mk-38's effective range was entered. The Mk-38 crew's log would note weapon man, target acquired, engagement resolved by CIWS before Mk-38 employment range, weapons safed. Total time from first contact acquisition to engagement resolution, 6 minutes and 27 seconds. The commanding officer looked at the clear picture, the debris field that was already beginning to disperse on the display. The commercial traffic to port and starboard had not deviated. The tanker in the northbound lane had been approximately 2.8 nautical miles from the engagement position and had presumably observed the CIWS engagement flash. The phalanx's muzzle flash at night is not subtle, but the tanker's course and speed had not changed, which was the correct response from a commercial vessel observing a naval engagement from 2.8 nautical miles in international waters. The tanker continued on. The strait continued to be 18 miles wide. Now, the intelligence picture from 6 minutes and 27 seconds, the acoustic signature, was the most operationally significant collection of the engagement. 11 seconds of RPM data from the contact's propulsion system at a range and signal quality that the previous library entry had not been collected at, comparing against that entry with the confidence upgrade from possible to probable that the acoustic processor had produced. The 11-second signature was primary data, not as long as the 43-minute diesel snorkel signature from the Kilo prosecution in the Gulf of Oman, not as complete as a sustained contact, but primary data from an operational contact at confirmed range during an active approach, which is data that cannot be produced from technical intelligence analysis of captured hardware or satellite imagery. The propulsion system's RPM at operational approach speed, the specific rotation rate at which the drone's motor was running as it closed on its target, at 14 knots, was now in the acoustic library with a higher confidence rating and a signal quality notation that the previous entry did not carry. The electro-optical system's thermal imagery from the engagement period was also packaged. The no personnel signature observation at 4.8 nautical miles was significant, specifically because of its range. The system had resolved the absence of an occupant thermal signature at a distance greater than any previous confirmed classification of a Houthi maritime drone, which meant the thermal library's detection range for occupant absence was updated from the previous maximum characterization range. Future contacts could be classified as probable, unmanned at greater range based on tonight's data. The Channel 16 non-response was logged with the timing. From hail to engagement, no response was received at any point. This added to the behavioral signature database for Houthi maritime surface drones, which the Force Protection Briefing document would use to update its classification methodology. A contact consistent with the drone profile that does not respond to Channel 16 within 60 seconds of hailing upgrades the classification confidence from possible to probable in the absence of other distinguishing factors. This was a procedural intelligence product, not a technical one, and procedural intelligence products are sometimes more operationally useful than technical ones because they improve the speed and confidence of decisions rather than the accuracy of sensors. What did the acoustic collection give us? The commanding officer asked the ASW coordinator at 22:15 when the post-engagement brief was running. The RPM signature at 14 knots approach speed, sir. The previous entry was from a contact assessed as the same drone type at an unknown approach speed. We didn't have the acoustic signature correlated with a known speed before. Now we have both. If we hear the signature again, we can correlate the RPM to the speed and estimate the contact's closure rate from acoustic data alone before the radar has resolved the contact size. The commanding officer noted this. Estimating a contact's closure rate from acoustic data before the radar resolves the contact's size was an earlier warning capability, a capability that would compress the classification window from the front rather than extending it from the back. Tonight's engagement had taken 6 minutes and 27 seconds from acquisition to resolution. The acoustic RPM to speed correlation meant that the next similar contact in similar conditions could potentially be classified approximately 90 seconds earlier in the approach sequence because the acoustic data would confirm the speed at the same range where currently only the size and course were available. 90 seconds of earlier confidence was not nothing in a strait that was 18 miles wide. The Bab-el-Mandeb Strait has seen the passage of maritime traffic since before recorded history. It has seen the Portuguese and the Ottoman Empire, and the British and the post-war oil economy, and the container revolution. It is currently seeing the Houthi maritime drone program and the U.S. Navy's response to it, and the response is producing, in each engagement, the specific incremental improvements that come from meeting a new threat in operational conditions and learning from the encounter in ways that the encounter's designers did not intend to teach. Tonight's drone had approached on the profile its designers had chosen, at the speed its propulsion could sustain, and had been classified by a combination of radar, electro-optical, acoustic, and behavioral data that would not have been available in the same combination at the same range 6 months ago. The acoustic RPM correlation, the thermal range update for occupant-absence, the Channel 16 behavioral signature. Each of these was a piece of the classification picture that this encounter had added to the picture that the next encounter would start from. Al Masirah television, by 7 a.m. the following morning, had a statement. The naval forces of Yemen had deployed maritime systems in the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait as part of the ongoing maritime campaign against the American aggressor and its allies. The statement did not include the classification timeline. The statement did not include the acoustic RPM signature. The statement did not include the thermal detection range update for the occupant-absence criterion. The statement described an operation. The intelligence annex described 6 minutes and 27 seconds of data collection that happened to coincide with the operation. USS Mason's deck log for the period read, 2144 to 2151, surface contact unknown, bearing 175, range 5 miles at acquisition, speed 14 knots. EO confirmed thermal signature. Acoustic probable classification 2149, CIWS engaged 2150, contact neutralized, transit continued. No damage, no personnel losses. Intelligence package transmitted 5th Fleet 2230. The intelligence annex was 4 pages. Page 3 was the acoustic RPM correlation. Page 4 was the thermal detection range update and the Channel 16 behavioral signature protocol recommendation. The Bab-el-Mandeb is 18 miles wide. It is the only way through. USS Mason transited it at 14 knots with an active threat environment and left the strait with 4 pages of intelligence that improved the next ship's classification toolkit. The strait did not get narrower. The toolkit got better. The drone had chosen the right waterway. It had not chosen the right target. Bye for now.